The neighborhood where we lived was one of those carefully groomed, picture perfect communities where the grass was cut to identical lengths, the mailboxes were all painted the same shade of beige, and the Homeowners Association prided itself on being the iron fist disguised as community organization. My wife and I had bought our home there a couple of years ago, not because we cared much for manicured lawns and monthly newsletters, but because the school district was excellent and the place felt safe. Ironically, it was my wife who ensured it was safe. She was the county sheriff, and she wore that badge with pride. What the HOA didn't know was that the very person they loved to send snide warning letters to was the woman who commanded the deputies they dialed up whenever they wanted to flex their authority. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning when my wife decided to plant some wildflowers in the small patch of garden near the mailbox. She had a green thumb, and after a week of long shifts and late night calls, gardening was her therapy. She was in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, hair tied up, no uniform in sight. I sat on the porch sipping coffee, watching her dig into the soil with that look of calm determination she always got when she was off duty and finally able to unwind. That was when the HOA president, a woman named Linda, who neighbors had not so affectionately nicknamed Clipboard Karen, came marching down the sidewalk like she was on patrol. She had her usual stack of forms in one hand and her phone in the other, her lips pursed into that permanent expression of dissatisfaction she seemed to reserve for everyone who didn't follow her personal interpretation of the bylaws. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. My wife barely looked up, giving her a polite nod before going back to planting. "Those aren't HOA-approved plants. You need to remove them immediately. Only the shrubs listed in the landscape guidelines are allowed." My wife, who had dealt with hardened criminals and violent offenders without breaking a sweat, merely smiled and said, "They're just flowers, Linda. They'll brighten up the block." That's when I saw the storm brewing. Linda didn't like being dismissed, not even politely. Her face turned red, and she started waving her clipboard like it was a weapon. "You can't just ignore the rules. This is a community. We all agreed to uphold the standards, and your little wildflower project is a violation." I almost laughed at the absurdity, but I knew better than to fuel the fire. My wife, still calm, said, "Well, I'll be happy to discuss it at the next meeting, but for now, I'm going to finish what I started." That was the breaking point. Linda pulled out her phone and, without hesitation, dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said loudly enough for us to hear. "There's a woman here trespassing and destroying community property. Please send someone immediately." I nearly choked on my coffee. Trespassing? Destroying property? She was planting flowers in our own yard. My wife just shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Within minutes, 2 patrol cars rolled up the street, lights flashing, sirens off, but the dramatic entrance was clearly meant to intimidate. The neighbors started peeking out their windows, and a few came onto their porches to watch the spectacle unfold. I could feel the tension rising, but my wife remained cool as ever, brushing the dirt off her hands and standing tall. The officers stepped out, clearly briefed on a disturbance situation, and one of them, Officer Ramirez, looked from Linda to my wife, confusion already setting in. He knew her. In fact, he worked under her. But in plain clothes, hair tied up, and no badge visible, he didn't immediately register who she was. Linda, however, wasted no time rushing up to them, pointing dramatically like she was unmasking a villain in a soap opera. "That's her. She's refusing to comply with HOA rules and vandalizing property. I demand you remove her." The officers glanced at my wife, who was now holding back a smirk. I knew exactly what she was thinking. She was letting this play out just to see how far Linda would go. Ramirez approached cautiously and said, "Ma'am, can we get your name?" My wife crossed her arms, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Sure, Sheriff Emily Carter." The silence that followed was almost comical. Ramirez blinked, his brain catching up to what he just heard. His partner's jaw practically dropped, and Linda, she went pale, her confidence draining faster than air from a punctured balloon. She stammered, "As sheriff? You can't be serious." Emily pulled out her badge, which she always kept clipped inside her bag, even off duty, and held it up. Very serious. And what's also serious is filing a false police report, which is exactly what you just did. The look on Linda's face when my wife revealed her badge was the kind of priceless moment you wish you could capture and frame forever. Her jaw went slack, her clipboard wobbled in her trembling hands, and for the first time since we had moved into this neighborhood, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac looked genuinely speechless. Officer Ramirez, now standing at full attention, gave a quick nod of respect and addressed my wife with a tone that had shifted instantly from casual inquiry to professional deference. "Sheriff Carter," he said, his voice steady but laced with surprise, "I didn't realize it was you. What exactly happened here?" Emily didn't even answer right away. She let Linda squirm in the silence, which stretched just long enough for the neighbors clustered on their porches to whisper among themselves. Finally, she said, "What happened is that I was planting flowers in my own yard, and this woman," she gestured toward Linda, "decided it was grounds for a 911 call, claiming I was trespassing and vandalizing. You can imagine my concern when law enforcement resources are being wasted like this." Ramirez looked at Linda, who was shaking her head furiously as if denying reality could undo it. "That's not true. She was breaking HOA rules, and I was enforcing them," she blurted out, her voice high-pitched and defensive. "The HOA has every right to demand compliance." Emily's expression hardened in that way I'd seen 1,000 times before, her professional mask sliding into place, the same one she used when interrogating suspects who thought they could talk their way out of a lie. "The HOA does not outrank the law, Linda," she said firmly. "And calling 911 for non-emergencies isn't enforcement. It's abuse of the system. Do you understand the difference?" The crowd of neighbors was growing, and a few even had their phones out, recording the interaction. I couldn't blame them. This was the showdown they'd all secretly been waiting for, the moment when the tyrant who handed out violation slips for lawn gnomes and Christmas lights stayed up too long was finally being put in her place. Linda, still red-faced and sputtering, tried to regain her footing. "I didn't know who she was," she said, gesturing wildly at Emily. "If I had known, I never would have called. You can't blame me for trying to maintain order." Emily took a step closer, lowering her voice, but with enough edge that it carried. "You should treat everyone with the same respect, whether they wear a badge or not. It shouldn't take finding out I'm the sheriff to stop you from making false reports against your neighbors." That struck a chord with the crowd. I heard a few murmurs of agreement ripple through them, and one of our neighbors, a retired veteran named Mr. Jenkins, even called out, "About time someone told her." Linda whipped around, glaring at him, but she was losing ground fast. Ramirez, now clearly uncomfortable, pulled out his notepad, going through the motions of documenting the call. "For the record, HOA disputes are civil matters," he explained. "Law enforcement doesn't handle things like what kind of plants are allowed in front yards. This was not an emergency and shouldn't have come to this." Emily folded her arms, her voice calm but unyielding. "And filing a false emergency call can result in fines or even criminal charges depending on intent. Linda, I strongly suggest you think about how you interact with your neighbors moving forward." For a moment, I thought Linda might faint. She swayed slightly, clutching her clipboard like a life preserver, her eyes darting between Emily, the officers, and the crowd that had gathered. It was the first time she looked small, not larger than life, and I almost felt a pang of pity for her. But then she did what she always did, doubled down. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "You're all ganging up on me. The HOA has rules, and if people don't follow them, then what's the point of having a community?" Emily gave a slow sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose, the way she did when dealing with stubborn suspects who refused to face reality. "No one is above the law, Linda. Not you, not me, not anyone. The point of a community is to support one another, not weaponize rules to intimidate people." I could see Linda's composure cracking like thin ice under too much weight. Her lips trembled as she scanned the faces around her, searching desperately for support, but All she found were neighbors shaking their heads or glaring back at her. Even her usual allies, the ones who had sat beside her at HOA meetings and nodded dutifully when she handed down new restrictions, were silent now, unwilling to be seen on her side in this very public humiliation. That was when Emily decided to end the charade. She straightened, her voice crisp. "Officer Ramirez, I think it's safe to say this situation is resolved. No further action is necessary unless Linda would like to contest this in court, in which case I'll be more than happy to testify under oath about what happened today." Ramirez nodded quickly, almost relieved to have a clear directive. "Understood, Sheriff." He gave Linda one last look, something between sympathy and frustration, before signaling to his partner to wrap things up. The officers returned to their cars, the flashing lights shutting off as if punctuating the end of the drama. The neighbors began drifting back to their porches, but not before giving Emily discreet nods of approval or outright smiles of gratitude. It was clear she had just won herself a lot of quiet supporters in the neighborhood. Linda, on the other hand, looked like a balloon slowly deflating, her bravado gone, her face pale and drawn. She clutched her clipboard tighter, muttering under her breath about unfair treatment and abuses of power, though no one seemed to care anymore. Emily turned back to her flowers, as if nothing had happened, kneeling down and gently patting soil around the fresh blooms. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, the sheriff planting seeds of change right after putting a tyrant in her place. I sat back on the porch, shaking my head with a grin. "You just made her public enemy number one," I teased. Emily chuckled softly, not looking up from her work. She made herself that a long time ago. Today, she just learned there are limits to how far she can push people. And as the sunlight filtered through the trees and neighbors exchanged whispers, I knew this wasn't the end of the saga. It was just the beginning. Linda wasn't the type to back down quietly, and though she had just been publicly humiliated, I could see the wheels already turning in her head. The HOA president had picked a fight she couldn't win, but that didn't mean she wouldn't try. The days following the flowerbed fiasco were unusually quiet, almost suspiciously so, like the calm before a storm, and although my wife went about her business as if the incident had never happened, I knew Linda well enough by now to recognize that she was the kind of person who nursed grudges the way others nurtured friendships. She wasn't going to let public humiliation at the hands of my wife, of all people, be the final word. For a while, it seemed like she had retreated, licking her wounds in private, but the signs of her next move soon began to appear. It started with letters slipped into our mailbox, anonymous but obvious in tone, citing obscure HOA bylaws and demanding compliance with regulations that bordered on the absurd. One letter claimed that the color of our shutters was too dark and disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic, even though they had been the same shade since the house was built. Another insisted that our trash cans had been left at the curb for 2 hours too long, despite the fact that the garbage truck had come later than usual that day. Each letter carried the same thinly veiled hostility, the same manufactured outrage designed to provoke. Emily would read them, chuckle, and toss them into a drawer, refusing to give Linda the satisfaction of a reaction. But I could see the quiet irritation in her eyes. She was used to dealing with criminals who posed real threats, not petty dictators hiding behind clipboards and bylaws, and the sheer pettiness of it all gnawed at her patience. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had witnessed the showdown started approaching us more openly, offering support in ways both small and significant. Mr. Jenkins stopped by to say he admired how Emily had stood her ground. A young couple across the street brought over cookies one evening, laughing as they confessed that Linda had fined them once for hanging a hammock in their backyard. "She's out of control," they whispered, "but no one ever stands up to her." It was becoming clear that Linda's iron grip on the neighborhood was weakening, cracks forming in the facade she had worked so hard to maintain, but that only made her more dangerous. When control slipped through her fingers, she doubled down. At the next HOA meeting, which Emily and I decided to attend purely out of curiosity, Linda tried to spin the incident as a misunderstanding. Standing at the front of the community center, she launched into a speech about maintaining standards and ensuring safety, her voice dripping with false sincerity. But the whispers in the crowd, the sidelong glances, and the subtle smirks told a different story. Her credibility had been damaged, and everyone knew it. When one resident raised a hand to ask why she had called the police over flowers, Linda flushed and snapped. "That's not what happened," before scrambling to change the subject. Emily, seated beside me with her arms crossed, leaned over and murmured, "She's spiraling." I couldn't have agreed more. But Linda wasn't done yet. A week later, Emily received a notice in the mail, not an anonymous letter this time, but an official summons to a compliance hearing with the HOA board. The charge? Repeated violations of landscaping guidelines. I laughed out loud when I read it, but Emily only shook her head. This isn't about flowers anymore. She's trying to set an example to prove she still has power. The hearing was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the clubhouse, and word spread quickly. By the time we arrived, the room was packed, not just with the board members and a few loyal followers of Linda, but with dozens of residents eager to see what would happen. It felt less like a meeting and more like a trial, complete with spectators whispering in the back rows. Linda presided over the board like a judge desperate to cling to authority, her eyes locking onto Emily with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "Sheriff Carter," she began, her voice steady but strained, "you have been repeatedly warned about your noncompliance with HOA landscaping rules, yet you continue to disregard them. This hearing is to determine appropriate consequences." Emily, calm as ever, leaned forward. "And what consequences are those exactly? Fines? Liens? You think that's going to hold up when the bylaws are selectively enforced?" Linda bristled, slamming her gavel, a ridiculous touch she had clearly added to the proceedings for dramatic effect. "This is not a courtroom. The HOA has full authority to enforce its rules." The crowd stirred, some chuckling at her theatrics, others murmuring discontent. Emily didn't raise her voice, but her words carried with the weight of authority. "Actually, this feels a lot like a courtroom, Linda. Except here, you're the prosecutor, judge, and jury all rolled into one. And that's not how justice works. Rules are supposed to apply equally to everyone, but I've noticed you don't find your friends when their lawns grow too long or when their holiday decorations stay up past January. You target people you don't like. That's not governance, that's harassment." The room erupted in whispers, and I saw several heads nodding vigorously. Linda's face turned crimson, her composure unraveling in front of her own supporters. "That's not true," she shouted, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Emily stood slowly, commanding the room without raising her voice. "You called the police on me for planting flowers. You wasted taxpayer resources because you wanted to flex your power. That's not leadership, that's abuse. And if this board wants to back you up on that, then maybe it's time we involve the county to review how this HOA operates." The effect was immediate. The board members who had been sitting stiffly at the table suddenly looked very nervous. The thought of county oversight was clearly not appealing to them, and they shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Emily's words. Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but nothing came out. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until one of the board members cleared his throat and said, "Perhaps we should table this matter for now and revisit it after further discussion." The crowd erupted in whispers again, this time more like cheers held under breath. Emily gave a polite nod and sat back down, her point made. Linda, defeated but not yet ready to admit it, slammed her gavel again and hastily adjourned the meeting. As we walked out, neighbors clapped us on the back, whispered thanks, and even openly laughed about the spectacle they had just witnessed. It was clear the tide had turned. For the first time, Linda's grip on the neighborhood had slipped, and people were no longer afraid to stand against her. But as Emily and I walked back home under the glow of street lamps, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my gut. Linda wasn't done. Not yet. Humiliation only fueled her determination, and I knew she'd go to even greater lengths to try and reassert control. The question was, how far was she willing to go? The night after the HOA hearing, when the air was thick with the lingering scent of freshly cut grass and the crickets sang their endless chorus, I caught sight of Linda pacing in front of her house, phone pressed to her ear, her posture rigid with fury. I couldn't hear the words, but I could guess the tone, sharp, clipped, full of indignation. Emily, ever composed, had already moved on with her evening routine, casually polishing her boots for the next day's shift while humming under her breath. But I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. Linda had been humiliated twice now, once in front of the entire neighborhood and once in a meeting where her authority had been shredded like tissue paper. People like her didn't just let things go. They escalated. And sure enough, the escalation came 3 days later in the form of a certified letter delivered to our door. It was a formal notice of legal action. The HOA, under Linda's leadership, was filing a lawsuit against us for willful destruction of community standards and endangering the integrity of the neighborhood. Emily read it aloud, her voice calm but tinged with disbelief, before laughing outright. "She really doesn't know when to quit," she said, tossing the papers onto the kitchen table. But beneath the laughter, I could see the steel hardening in her eyes. Emily had fought hardened criminals, drug cartels, and violent offenders. If Linda thought a civil lawsuit was going to scare her, she had chosen the wrong opponent. The legal papers, of course, were laughably flimsy, filled with exaggerated claims and cherry-picked bylaws taken out of context. Our lawyer, a longtime family friend, practically rolled his eyes when he read them. "This is paper thin," he said. "It won't hold up in court. Honestly, she's just wasting her own money." But Emily wasn't satisfied with simply letting the case collapse on its own. She wanted to ensure this nonsense stopped for good. So she decided to take the offensive. She began compiling her own file, a meticulous record of every frivolous notice, every anonymous letter, every instance of selective enforcement in the HOA's history. She reached out to neighbors who had been unfairly fined or harassed, and they came forward eagerly, providing copies of violation slips and recounting absurd accusations: Christmas lights taken down under threat of fines, children's toys labeled as unsightly debris, backyard grills declared non-compliant. It was a damning collection of evidence, and with each page added, I could see Emily's case against Linda growing stronger. The lawsuit that Linda had so confidently filed became the rope with which she was tying her own noose. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had once feared Linda began openly supporting Emily, dropping by to offer statements, whispering encouragement, and even volunteering to testify if it came to that. The power dynamic in the neighborhood had shifted completely, and Linda could sense it. I watched her stalk from house to house, trying to rally support, her voice rising in desperation as she pleaded with former allies. But one by one, doors closed in her face. By the time the first court date rolled around, Linda looked worn down, her once meticulously styled hair frazzled, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She had expected this to be a show of force, a chance to reassert her dominance, but instead it became a public unmasking. In front of the judge, Emily calmly presented her evidence, her voice steady and measured as she laid out a pattern of harassment, misuse of HOA power, and the frivolous nature of Linda's lawsuit. The neighbors who testified did so with quiet dignity, their stories echoing the same theme. Linda had abused her position for years, and enough was enough. The judge listened intently, flipping through the thick binder of documentation Emily had assembled, and when Linda finally had her chance to speak, her words were a jumble of contradictions, excuses, and personal grievances that sounded more like a rant than a legal argument. It was over before it even began. The judge dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled, and issued a stern warning to Linda about abusing the legal system. But that wasn't the end of it. Several neighbors, emboldened by Emily's leadership, filed formal complaints with the county about the HOA's conduct. Within weeks, an official review was launched, and the spotlight turned squarely onto Linda. Faced with mounting pressure, dwindling support, and the possibility of personal liability, Linda did the one thing none of us expected. She resigned. No dramatic speech, no farewell tour, just a curt notice taped to the clubhouse door announcing her immediate departure from the board. When I told Emily, she only shrugged, her eyes on the flowers blooming by our mailbox. It was bound to happen, she said simply. The neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Without Linda's iron grip, the HOA meetings became collaborative instead of combative, with residents actually discussing improvements rather than nitpicking violations. Neighbors started putting up decorations again. Kids played in yards without fear of complaint slips, and there was a sense of relief in the air, like a weight had been lifted. Emily, never one to seek recognition, went back to her routine, though I noticed the nods of respect she received whenever she walked down the street in uniform. People waved, smiled, and even stopped to thank her for standing up when no one else could. And Linda? Rumors swirled that she had moved in with a sister across town, too embarrassed to show her face after the very public downfall. Some said she was planning to start over in another HOA community, but if that was true, I pitted her future neighbors. As for us, life settled back into the kind of peace we had hoped for when we first bought the house. The flowers Emily had planted thrived, growing into a small burst of color that stood out proudly against the uniform beige of the other yards. They became a symbol not just for us, but for the entire neighborhood, a reminder that rules should serve people, not the other way around, and that sometimes it takes just one person brave enough to stand up to a bully to change everything. On quiet evenings, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily would smile and say, "All this over a few flowers," and I'd laugh, knowing it had never really been about the flowers. It had been about power, control, and the courage to confront it. And in the end, my wife, the sheriff, the protector, the woman who planted seeds of justice in more ways than one, had shown everyone that no matter how loud or overbearing someone might be, the truth, when spoken firmly and fairly, would always bloom brighter.